I'm Gary Downey. On behalf of Kacey, my co-editor, Brent Jezik, who is a contributor to the volume, and all the other contributors, I want to thank ASEE and IE, as well as Morgan Claypool Publishers, who's funding the reception, for supporting this event. I want to thank Les Gerhardt and Norm Fortenberry in particular for getting this launch event going. Warren Salade of ASEE, Peggy Blumenthal of IIE, and Andrea Kopperwitz of Morgan and Claypool for getting this launch event launched. And thanks to you for coming to join us here on a day that I've gathered has become known as cooler than yesterday. That's not how I characterize it. I just got here today. But to celebrate the gifts from these 18 contributors. In addition to their labors, the project is also the product of support from the National Science Foundation. I want to thank Dr. Russell Kimmel from the Transforming Undergraduate Education in STEM program from Virginia Tech, also supported us. And under a different hat, Norm Fortenberry, who when he worked at Kacey, Center for the Advancement of Scholarship and Engineering Education at the National Academy of Engineering, hosted the workshop that became a key portion of this project, which I'll mention in a minute. Brent and I are going to tag team here a little bit, so thanks for your time over the next few minutes. I want to start, actually. Let's do it that way. I want to start by directing you to this handout that has a picture of the book. Go to page 3. And I'll introduce you to Rick Vaz, who's sitting between Brent and Kacey right now. He's not here. This is Rick. Page 3. As I sat on the plane, my mood was not one of serenity. I wondered just what I had gotten myself into. Of course, I was looking forward to experiencing Venice and helping the students bring their work to fruition, but I spoke only a smattering of Italian and had little sense of how we would negotiate local authorities and constraints. In retrospect, I suppose I should have asked a few more questions of my colleague Fabio Carrera, a native Venetian who had arranged the project and helped us choose a quiet neighborhood for testing, since I soon found myself being interrogated by elderly residents, and in one memorable case, armed Italian military police, about why we were drilling holes in the aging canal walls for brackets and fixtures. I was fascinated by the range of issues involved in these interdisciplinary projects, and I was struck by how they challenged the students to think critically, communicate effectively, and understand the social and cultural contexts of the problems they address. Students concerned with restoration of public art, for example, had to consider not just restoration techniques, but also the city's priorities and political processes, artisans' motivations and traditions, residents' concerns, and a host of local statutes and regulations. I also began to understand some of the complexities of negotiating cultural difference and the value to students of such understanding. Students studying urban design, for example, had to first understand the roles of private and public space in Dutch culture, which differ greatly from those in the US, and how those roles inform appropriate designs of green space. Turn to page 6. On the right-hand column, halfway down, we're also fortunate to have Anu Ramaswamy sitting between Brent and Kacey. A paragraph from her. She's at the University of Colorado, Denver. Although I went on to attend one of India's best engineering schools for an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering, my college experiences were curiously not as foundational in establishing the linkage between user need and expert virtuosity engineering values, nor the connection between people or nature and people, as were the childhood experiences that I described above. Page 7, left-hand column, halfway down, we accidentally combined 2 paragraphs. Without a sound, and thanks by the way to Kacey who put this together. Without a sound understanding of the locality, the professors, this is Linda Phillips, who teaches International Senior Design. The professors were not open to the outside-the-box analysis that her senior design students who had gone to Bolivia presented. And leaving the presentation room, tearful ISD students, International Senior Design students, were criticized by professors and student peers for having done an imitation of Habitat for Humanity. By contrast, industry advisory board members commended the students for their approach and methods and commented that they preferred to hire students with experience who could rely on basic theory and unconventional approaches rather than traditional students with higher grades. Page 8, beginning at the very bottom. Alan Parkinson, Dean of Engineering at Brigham Young. I have been a little bit surprised regarding how I have come to feel about humanitarian projects. Previously, I viewed study abroad as a way to learn what developed countries were doing and how to prepare our students to remain competitive in the global marketplace. However, I have come to understand that another motivation for promoting international technical experience relates to the range and scale of technological needs of humankind in the 21st century. And go now, page 13, the final one. Those first group from the 9 engineers who participated. The second group of 7 come from the non-engineers or hybrids, such as myself and Juan Lucena. Phil McKnight, left-hand column. I'll read this whole. I asked him if he thought that we would have formed such a close relationship with Siemens and would have developed the Siemens TU Munich program as successful had I not spoken fluent German with him, Caligari and other Siemens executives and employees. He responded, no. My own change of direction began while still employed in the motorcycle shop, trying to make ends meet as a single parent when I enrolled in a summer program at the University of Virginia. Perhaps a self-styled biker humanist with a PhD in German could not succeed in this environment, and no doubt I was projecting a much too ambitious entry level for myself, but these events most definitely were opening new pathways and new ideas. Do we want to produce engineers, or other graduates for that matter, who will work quietly on their projects and in their labs, producing commercially viable products without regard to their impact on the environment or economic structures? Or do we want to produce an intelligentsia that will understand how to employ technology, science, and the humanities in ways that have a principled positive impact on society and the world in which we live? Okay, these are just a few small examples from several hundred pages of fascinating first-person accounts by these contributors. This project was built on a question. What led a bunch of crazy people to devote so much of their time and energy to helping students gain new forms of knowledge that might be called international, and indeed sometimes at considerable cost to their careers? One contributor, Bernd Wittig, for example, pretty much gave up tenure at MIT because of this interest. Now, in the early part of this last decade, certainly by 2005, with the publication of Friedman's The World is Flat and the 2 NAE report, Engineer of 2020, two pretty clear reasons emerged for global or international engineering education, and that was to advance American economic competitiveness and advance the employability of engineers. And these are certainly important reasons. If we lose sight of them, we risk losing engineers. But think of the question, and I pose this question to all of you here. Why do you do what you do? Why? Folks at ASEE, IIE. Now turn that question sideways a little bit in order to try and answer it. Through what pathway did you come to do what you are doing now? Through what sort of trajectory? Can you plot it? This is the type of question that we propose to contributors. For many years, I have watched and listened to people interested in the international education of engineers, and saw on many occasions motivations, interests, desires that went far beyond what was emerging as dominant. Then one day, I found myself in a telephone conversation with this one Dr. Russell Pimmel about global engineering education. And to him, I proposed a different sort of project, one that in a way builds upon my own approach to policy analysis based upon some work I did in DC a long time ago. Consensus reports tend to bring together a diversity of perspectives, identify a singular future, and then try and figure out how to get there. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. I wanted to try a completely different approach, one that begins by describing and analyzing the diversity that lives in the present. And then describing that diversity, figure out how to take a first step. Because you can never get anywhere except by starting here. So where are we? Now, we were talking about a workshop organization, so the idea was to bring together people who have been involved for a long time and get them to trace their own trajectories, answering that question, using a method that we use in a course called Engineering Cultures, a method we call location, knowledge, and desire. How are you located in relationship to whom? How are they located? What do you know? What do they know? What do you want? What do they want? I invited Juan Lucena and Brent Jezik to help organize, and Kacey Beddoes joined us a few months later. It was Juan who suggested the term personal geography that lives in this volume. So the project itself involved identifying, inviting participants, getting abstracts, getting manuscripts, getting a background study that Brent and Kacey produced. And then we brought everybody together in this uniquely structured workshop whose key feature was that when we discussed individual manuscripts, the authors were prohibited from participating in those discussions. And the effect was to transform it from an author meets critics situation into a collective process of authorship, shared authorship. And it really had the effect of bringing people together. A long revision process, development of introduction, epilogue, appendices, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, the construction of a detailed index, which Kacey took responsibility for. It's really important, this index, because it makes the book a lot more usable. You can track things down there. Now, the major outcome, in my judgment, lies in another question. But I'm going to stop for a moment and invite Brent up here to tell you a little bit about their chapter contribution, some background on the emergence of international and global engineering education.
Well, thanks, Gary. I also want to reiterate thanks to ASEE and IIE for organizing and supporting this wonderful event, and to all of you for coming out today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the second chapter of the volume, which is really historical in nature. When we got into this project, I think in line with a lot of the other work we had done and work we'd done around the Engineering Cultures course, we got to thinking about this question of how did we get here in longer terms, right? How did we get here over the span of decades? How did we start having engineering students go abroad? How did we first start having engineering faculty members develop this interest, even if they were often by themselves, in going abroad, and maybe finding their colleagues here and there who are also developing this interest? So Kacey and I dug into the literature and of course, some of the materials from IIE and other organizations and ASEE archives were tremendously helpful in this. And we were able to really trace this back, at least 50 or so years. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the themes that we see in that history. And of course, if you want more details, take a look at the chapter.
Let me interrupt for a second.
Please.
Please feel free to stand up and go get food and drink, so that Morgan Claypool feels their money was well spent.
We won't be offended. So we dug into the literature, and I think a lot of the themes that you see in the chapters in terms of the drivers that motivate people, that motivate institutions, that motivate the creation of programs and opportunities have a very long history indeed. And so we try to bring out some of that historical depth and historical texture. What's interesting is that if you look at some of the earliest motivations for study abroad very generally, world diplomacy and world peace was sort of a major consideration, and you see this in the post-World War I context. You also see this post-World War II. And in that interwar period, and then immediately after the Second World War, where you have some pretty big expansions of study abroad more generally, and in some ways that sets the stage for the growth of global engineering education. So this notion of diplomacy is very important in this, and of sort of nurturing world peace. But we also find, especially in the immediate post-war period, increasing recognition that at least some engineers are going to need some skills to work abroad. There's things like the Marshall Plan reconstruction. Even during the war, there's a lot of construction projects going on in the entire Allied sort of world. And so there's this recognition that some American engineers may need to go abroad, including as agents of American corporations. So this starts to generate conversation in the 1940s and 1950s that, maybe we could be doing something to start preparing some of our American engineers to be ready to go abroad. And so maybe if some of our American students can start developing skills and competencies that they would need to be effective abroad. But it takes a little while before formal programs actually get launched, which actually focus on engineering student populations. And so we talk a little bit about some of the forerunners here. The Antioch Education Abroad program is one that's probably been researched more than others. That got launched in the late 1950s and early 1960s, focusing especially on business and engineering students, one of the first of its kind. The International Association for the Exchange of Students for Technical Expertise, I had to write that down, that's so hard, was established around 1948, but started to expand in the US, and that enabled American students, including engineers and scientists, to actually go to other countries, especially in Europe, to actually do research or to do work internships. University of Wisconsin had early programs with Monterey Tech in Mexico, where they were specifically partnering with the engineering colleges and departments, sending students back and forth, and that grew into a larger consortium. And then there was the MIT Inter-American program, which was more research-oriented. So these were just some of the precursors you see in the 1950s into the 1960s. What you see, though, so that's in part a diplomacy sort of theme that comes out of this, but also recognition that we need more engineering professionals and engineering academics who can actually go out and be effective working across borders, whether they're affiliated with universities or industry. What we see in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s is a new theme emerge, and that's one really that's focused on development assistance. And this is about going out into the developing countries and especially engineers and other technical experts and supporting development in various guises in those contexts. And again, recognizing that traditional engineering education might not adequately prepare those people for those types of work. We see some really interesting programs, such as the UCLA RITA program, which was in Brazil. We talk about that a little bit. Michigan State University starts a dual degree program where you essentially earn one degree in engineering and then a liberal arts degree that's focused on foreign languages and foreign cultures. Again, this is way back in the 1960s. Agencies like AID in the 1970s are starting to call for technical professionals that can go out into developing contexts and be effective on the ground. ASEE really expands its international profile in the 1970s. George Washington University starts a degree program. But if you look at study abroad during this period, it's as Peggy said, study abroad isn't really increasing so much. The numbers stay pretty flat. So you see these sort of, things popping up here and there, but then they tend to die back down. The third sort of theme we look at really emerges in the 1980s, and that's the image of competitiveness, and Gary talked about this a little bit. When I try to introduce this to my students, I like to show them clips from the movie Gung Ho with Tom Hanks. Most of them haven't seen it, but many of you probably have. Gung Ho really captures this American sense of unease about the rise of Japan as an economic and technological powerhouse. And so in response, a lot of universities, including engineering schools and colleges, start establishing programs that are focused on Japan. So for example, the MIT Japan Study Abroad program is established during this time. University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has a lot of activities going on at this time, especially a guy named Howard Wakeland, some of you may have heard of, who's very active. And that brings us to the present, where we sort of have this globalization theme emerging, where there's growing recognition that engineers need to be ready to practice across countries, to practice across cultures, and not only for multinational corporate needs, but also in light of grand challenges, engineering grand challenges that necessarily cross national boundaries, regional boundaries, continental boundaries. I think one of the most telling expressions of the extent to which this new mandate, this globalization mandate, has been legitimated is through accreditation criteria. And actually, the ABEC criteria are one of the weakest examples, but there's an explicit global dimension in the ABEC criteria. But if you go and look at Engineers Australia criteria for professional engineers, you look at the Europe-based EURACE accreditation criteria, you look at the Civil Engineering Body of Knowledge report, they all have a very strong global dimension that explicitly acknowledges these different abilities and competencies that engineers need to be able to work across countries and cultures. So what we've actually seen as well in this globalization phase is increasingly seeing a lot of these historical precedents sort of become intertwined. Okay, so we have this globalization discourse. There's still concerns about American competitiveness, and you see that language emerge. We see development assistance as very prominent, especially through humanitarian engineering programs, Engineers Without Borders, Engineers for a Sustainable World. And we see this sort of a modern concept of diplomacy still very prominent, and the concept of global citizenship and global citizens has really emerged as sort of the 20th century discourse of diplomacy. So we see all those themes sort of coming back to the fore in the present, and at times in tension with one another, but more often than not, I think, intertwined. But the other thing I think we see in the historical record is when we look at the barriers to internationalizing engineering education, there's remarkable constancy in those barriers. We see, if you go back 50 years, you could practically take out blocks of text and put them in reports today, and they wouldn't seem out of place. You see discussions about crowded curriculum, concerns about time to degree, lack of language preparation among engineering students, financial considerations, a lack of awareness or interest of the importance of global education among engineering students, and I could go on and on. But what you also see in those historical examples is the importance of having, first of all, institutional and or administrative support, especially at the university level, and also having passionate faculty. And I think that's another real key tie-in to the rest of this volume, showing the importance of having passionate faculty to drive these programs forward. So I'm just going to briefly turn it back over to Gary.
So, what do participants in transformational experiences in international engineering education know after their experiences that they didn't know beforehand? And how is this engineering? Now, this is not an easy question to answer. It's especially difficult to answer with respect to engineering because the dominant image, the dominant curricular practice in engineering draws a sharp boundary between a valued core, which is characterized as the technical, which is surrounded by peripheries, which are characterized as largely non-technical. How do transformational experiences get counted as engineering in that context? One thing that emerged from all these interactions that lives in these texts, and it's something that Norman mentioned is in now an ASEE report, engineering faculty, by and large, do not care about international education. They view it as not minimally outside. It's on the periphery. And to the extent that it's getting attention, it could be threatening. Engineering students care about international education as much as faculty do. That's a joke. You get the point. If faculty don't care, students are not going to care. Now, if faculty care, they get it into their curricula. Then students care. Therein lies the rub. The primary audiences for this book are indeed engineering faculties and administrators and administrative folks who are involved in, related to, contributing to, believe in international, in this case, engineering education. I mean, some folks from IIE are working beyond the boundaries of engineering education, but in the same spirit. So this book is aimed at folks who are considering, folks who are trying, folks who are struggling, and folks who have no interest in it at all, and hopefully the book drops in their lap. The book, by the way, is available, I should point out, not only in printed form, but you can. But those who are at universities that subscribe to the Morgan and Claypool series, as many universities now do, that means that faculty and students can gain access to electronic versions of the book for free. Faculty can download it. So if somebody wants to assign it to students, they can download it for free and distribute it for free. And Morgan and Claypool expects that people are going to share it with other people elsewhere. They figure it helps build the brand. So it's one of the reasons why we went with them. They're in a way, they're on the cutting edge here with electronic publishing. But faculty are what we're trying to reach here. The folks that we're trying to reach, and the administrative infrastructures that live around them, we're trying to reach. Finding is, and something else that emerged from these narratives, from these accounts, is that existing programs consist of relatively small networks of people and institutions, led by committed, charismatic individuals who might disappear at any moment. And when they do, then whole edifices fall down, or risk of falling down. And they produce activities that live on the peripheries. I mean, study abroad, student exchanges is co-curricular activity. You've got to transfer credits back, unless it's built from inside out. Internships, study abroad, tend to be supplemental, added on, based on student interest. International projects, service learning, supplemental, based on student interest. Capstone design, okay, not supplemental, but relatively marginal to the curriculum. And as the quote from Linda Phillips pointed out, if you go too far, you can cross a boundary and be seen as outside of engineering and now doing Habitat for Humanity. Dual degree programs, often the second degree is only marginally connected to the first, but nonetheless, they're combined in a student's body, so this is a good thing. Certificates and minors work their way into the curricula, but students have to plan early if they're going to get involved. Elective courses, such as one I teach and Kacey teaches, Brent's deeper. Engineering cultures or language courses, I mean, they depend upon the will of students. What we found in this book is that the agents of change themselves tended to have some sort of transformational experiences in their own career trajectories. Transformational experiences that had significant knowledge content. We characterize this, or I characterize in the introduction, as the process of encountering an American engineering self. It makes visible the extent to which engineering knowledge, engineering practice, has knowledge content, but also normative content. It's about service as well. And what these contributors found out is that their experiences went beyond the relatively narrow interpretations that are given to the knowledge and service. The engineering knowledge is well-bounded, as I was just pointing out, and service means generally helping advance progress in the United States tends to be about increasing standards of living for the masses, which tends to mean working in a private company. Well, these stories here, these accounts, push the boundaries around the core. So, for example, I'm mindful of the time. There's my starting point here. With Rick Vaz, he found himself interested in calling attention to the political, social, and human dimensions of engineering. Dan Hurlimann, formerly at Purdue, now of University of California at Merced, dean. His life, his work as a professor has been involved in trying to link his research work, his work on engineering education, to what he calls an expansive life, connecting the two. Margie Pennell at University of Dayton wants to fit the practitioner to the person. How do you do that in engineering? Joe Mook, University of at Buffalo, he is trying to redefine engineering to include a new specialty. This is a specialty. Anu Ramaswamy came to see the purely technical as a box out of which he needed to climb. Linda Phillips found herself questioning. She spent years and years as managing construction projects. She found herself questioning what she designs, to what ends. Les Gerhardt found that this work serves as resources for more than just a country. So he started to think globally. Alan Parkinson, who's dean at BYU, is juxtaposing the humanitarian with the competitive. Jim Mihalsic at University of South Florida finds himself redefining measures of performance for faculty, and so on. Among students, individual study abroad, for example, helps participants learn how engineering curricula are organized in another country. This has knowledge content. Service learning can help you understand how infrastructure projects are organized at neighborhood, regional, or national levels, and hence, help students gain a glimpse of what they might need to know in the job. International internships can help students understand how corporate organizations or NGOs operate in other countries, facilitating comparisons at home, and so on. So this work pushes the boundaries and challenges people to think through how they define what it means to be an engineer, and then and more often than not, expand that. And also expand what counts as engineering service. And I'm coming to conclusion here before going back to Brent. I just mentioned Alan Parkinson moving from focusing on competitiveness but to humanitarian work. Margie Pinnell at Dayton is looking for ways of promoting peace through engineering. Jim Mihalsic is dedicated to more sustainable environmental practices. Anu Ramaswamy seeks deeper involvement of engineers in local communities while persuading local communities to address global problems, and so on. So the point here is that these accounts, in contrast with, say, the consensus report that takes a diversity, produces an image of the future and tries to get there, this one purposely presents a picture of diversity, in the hope that readers will, in reading these different accounts, assess themselves in relationship to it, come up with ideas that they could use at home, and then maybe make new contributions that they see as holes in existing work. Brent?